Could a single man, relying only on his physical strength and unshakable determination, become world's most dangerous and feared prisoner? Meet Charles Bronson, a man who spent the majority of his life behind bars. But here is the interesting fact. He was not in prison for the crimes he committed, but for the violent behavior in prison. With a complex personality, Bronson's life story is a living example of defiance, anger, and resilience. But how did a young man with an ordinary upbringing and passion for fitness transform into the most feared prisoner of the UK? What fuels his unstoppable spirit and infamous reputation? Discover the incredible story of Charles Bronson, marked by violence, strange behavior, and a continuous struggle for identity. Be prepared, as this story will change what you think about crime and punishment. On 6 December 1952, in the quiet town of Luton, Bedfordshire, Michael Gordon Peterson was born to Ira and Joe Peterson, one of their 3 sons. His father owned a club in Aberystwyth, and his aunt and uncle were serving as mayor of Luton in the 1960s and 1970s. His aunt described that Bronson was a boy with a very ordinary background and was tender by nature. When Bronson was young, he was mild-mannered, kind, and was a bright child. Earlier in his childhood, he never used to bully and was the one who used to defend the weak, but later on his life changed when he was in his teenage years. He moved to Ellesmere Port, Cheshire, along with his family. This port town, located 6 miles from Chester, is where he first started getting into trouble. Early in his teenage years, he was caught stealing and had to face juvenile court. These aggressive tendencies and love for fighting he had often caused trouble. He enjoyed fighting from an early age, which is what led him to be absent from school. Bronson moved back to Luton, the place he always considered his true hometown. There he took a lot of jobs after leaving school, from hod carrier to a variety of jobs in factories and even jobs on fairgrounds. Despite holding down numerous jobs, such as working as a hod carrier in factories and on fairgrounds, Bronson's hunger for violence and petty crime remained insatiate. He was later diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, and in 1947, at the age of 21, he was convicted for the first after having smashed a few parked cars because he got into an argument with his girlfriend's father. Bronson's first serious brush with the first law came when he was 22. This time, he was convicted of armed robbery. Bronson entered the post office with the intention of stealing money armed with a firearm. The manner of the robbery was not particularly sophisticated. It was bold and aggressive. During the heist, Bronson used threats and intimidation to force the staff to comply with his demands. Despite his efforts to avoid capture, the police quickly responded at the scene and managed to catch him shortly after the robbery. He was sent to the Walton Gaol and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. Due to his violent nature, 2 of his fellow prisoners were attacked by him. This led to his transfer to Hull Prison. There, he refused to engage in prison work and continued his violence, which further became the reason to shift him to various high-security prisons. No matter how many measures the prison authorities took to control his violent streaks, Bronson never seemed to stop behaving violently. His life in Hull Prison was a series of hourly confrontations with other inmates and the jail staff. Bronson's non-cooperation in the programs and frequent involvement in brawls made him one of the most difficult prisoners to handle. This period of imprisonment set the tone for Bronson's future in the British prison system. His relentless defiance and aggression would lead to further sentences and prolonged periods in solitary confinement. The beginning of a life spent largely behind bars was the initial 7-year sentence for armed robbery. Over the next years, Bronson's reputation evolved to that of the most violent prisoner in Britain, influenced by the ongoing involvement in acts of violence, as well as by the inability to adjust to the prison environment. Bronson's initial period of incarceration provided the building block of his legendary status within the British prison system, and his anarchistic life of violent mutinies, whilst constantly being transferred to the highest security prisons, was an initiation to the years of warfare and infamy that followed. His first few years in prison rendered him one of the most notorious convicts ever in British penal history. Charles Bronson's early years in prison were marked by frequent frights and violent outbursts. Upon entering the prison system, his aggressive tendencies quickly surfaced. His initial placement at Walton Gaol saw him attacking fellow inmates, leading to his transfer to Hull Prison. His violent nature made him a highly challenging inmate to manage. The refusal of Bronson to engage in prison work and his continual acts of violence resulted in numerous clashes with prison staff. His resistance to those in authority quickly caused physical confrontations, and this only further complicated his position within the prison and ensured that he served a longer time than was strictly required behind bars. During his early incarceration, Bronson developed a routine, transforming his body through intense physical and mental well-being in an otherwise harsh environment. Bronson's physical transformation was notable. He gained a reputation for his extraordinary strength and endurance, capable of performing impressive feats of physical powers. This reputation not only made him more intimidating to those around him, but also solidified his fearful reputation within the prison. Despite various transfers to different high-security prisons, Bronson's violent behavior persisted. His continuous involvement in fights and his refusal to conform to prison rules highlighted his relentless defiance. Every violent outburst only earned him additional time behind bars, and it simply put him on a vicious cycle of violence and retaliation. The early days in the sentence of Bronson pretty much summarize how his life would go in the British penal system. He was endlessly obstinate, and with his penchant for physical fitness, such a trait defined his life in prison. With time, his legend as one of the most dangerous convicts in Britain spread, and he became infamous in the system of prisons. The brawls and the taste for defiance against authority in early life set the path for the remainder of his years, and he is sure to be written about in the pages of British history as one of the most infamous convicts. On July 14, 1987, Michael Gordon Peterson changed his life and his public perception. He adopted the name Charles Bronson after the American tough guy. The name was actually suggested by his fight promoter, believing that the new name would create a more intimidating and marketable image for his budding career in bare-knuckle boxing. The new name symbolized potency, invulnerability, and an indomitable spirit, which are qualities that Bronson totally assimilated. He was now entering a new chapter in his life. Bronson's theater in prison became more dramatic and attention-seeking. He pulled off scores of stunts, from covering himself in butter to make it hard for the staff to catch him to take hostages when demanding ridiculous items like an inflatable doll and carbonated drinks. All this did nothing but point out his defiance and successfully brought attention to him from the media, which became the reason for his infamous rise. But he is most known today for an event in 1982. He climbed onto the roof of a psychiatric ward and protested for the next 5 days. In those 5 days, he caused thousands of pounds of damage, removing the titles on the floor and tossing them at the staff who were in the yard below. He was eventually coaxed down after his family engaged in intense negotiations with him. That dramatic act of rebellion on his part further caught the eye of the media and hence made him Britain's most dangerous prisoner. Charlie Bronson became a man who could consistently defy and was totally unpredictable within the British prison system. His potential to question authority and to create anarchy within the walls made him a new icon of protest and insurrection. He would identify more with his street references and his original name, which unfortunately had been all but lost in infamy. Charles Bronson's time in prison is marked by numerous hostage situations, which was another weapon he used to demonstrate his control and insubordination. One of the most sensational hostage incidents of Charles Bronson involved him in 1999 at Hull Prison. There, Charles Bronson took a civilian education worker hostage. This hostage situation continued for 40 hours, during which Charles Bronson, in his usual bizarre mannerisms, demanded his cell to be painted with sky blue and demanded for an inflatable doll, a helicopter, and the mayor of London. He dragged the hostage around the prison, making him terrified, and used him as a shield from potential guards. In another incident, he took 2 Iraqi hijackers and another inmate hostage at Belmarsh prison and forced them to wear masks and call him general, besides ordering them to tickle his feet. Such incidents were enough to show his unpredictability and dangerousness. The after effects of the hostage incidents were severe. He shifted from one high-security prison to another after every hostage incident to minimize his management trouble. In the name of hostage-taking and other violent incidents, Charles Bronson had been detained in solitary confinement for long periods. These extended stays were meant to protect other inmates and the staff, but took a heavy toll on his mental health. Solitary confinement worsened his already volatile behavior, which led to further psychological deterioration. The lack of social interactions and the harsh terms of isolation only fueled his anger and frustration, rendering him more unpredictable and uncontrollable. Much of what was supposed to be punishment, solitary confinement primarily served to fuel Bronson's sense of rebellion and further cement his position as Britain's most dangerous criminal. The overall effects of these long spells of isolation were deeply etched in the psyche, one where violence triggered punishment and vice versa. This only serves to point out how difficult a punishment is to administer when dealing with a raging and relentless criminal like Bronson, and the lengths to which prisons went in order to confine him. Charles Bronson came to realize that his behavior was an energetic and brutal outlet of his personality over the years spent behind bars. It became the one pivotal moment that would soon bring constructive expression to his largely turbulent emotions. Drawing and painting became a way for Bronson to get the whole chaos blockading within him out into the world in the form of creative works that showed the full complexity of mentality and experience. His addiction to art was a background for a lot of the world, which represented not only his struggle and thoughts, but also hard prison life. It is not a surprise that the work of Bronson was highly appreciated on many levels, and in 2001, he was awarded the Koestler Trust Award, which concerned the art of prisoners. This somehow proved he is right, as well as gave incentives for even better work. His painted works have appeared at different galleries, but as well as a very high amount of auctions. His exhibitions are a subject of interest not only for art lovers, but also for random commoners. They attract limelight to the private world of the famous prisoner, showing the flip side of his otherwise reputation of being violent. For Bronson, it was a means of living, a positive way of blowing off boundless energy and aggression. In his art, Bronson had found a way to vent his emotions in a healthy way, turning his passion into a powerful form of self-expression. He found art as a means of focusing the energy and aggression, but the violence in this man continued from one incident to the next. Many high-profile incidents in prison have littered this time behind the bar and kept him in the public eye. Inside, Bronson's life had seen him swell with media attention, and the reason was his actions and unpredictability that saw become the headline in many articles and reports. In 2000, he wrote his autobiography, Bronson, which gave people an insight into his life and mind. His autobiographical book was published with raw and uncensored insights into life and the mind to be riveting to readers, and thus it contributed to his infamous legend. The 2008 film based on his life, titled Bronson, only perpetuated the attention that the media had in his life. The film by Nicholas Winding Refn seems to be the reflection of his life, focusing on his creepy, violent nature and complex personality. Tom Hardy in the title role actually portrayed the character with an eerie sense, which made Bronson's character not only charming but brutal. The film not only did exceptionally well in the public approval, but also mounted his status, turning him into a cult figure. It showed the dichotomy in his character, a man of the most extreme violence, but with an eerie, charismatic touch and talent. The media continued to keep an eye on Bronson for his continued story, which calmed the attention of mass. But in the hype of the media, they would overshadow his creative side to cover his violent incidents and melodramatic behavior. Media would concentrate on his infamy, describing him as Britain's most dangerous prisoner. Life of Bronson testifies to the complexity and difficulty of change in deep-set features despite artistic efforts. A lot of media attention and his representation in popular culture has given him immortal status and created a symbol of defiance and controversy in the core of the British penal system. Charles Bronson's life is an epic of refusal and human complexity, an account that challenges the very notions of crime and punishment. Yet his life was not his successions of acting out in violence and exceptional artistic feats. His life was also a continued quest for meaning and identity. The same man who terrorized prison staff and fellow inmates was the same person who attempted to explain his story through the autobiography. Behind bars, Bronson's life reflects his defiance of society's way of looking at criminals. His actions could not be easily categorized, and his acts called for a re-examination of what is good or bad. His relentless defiance underlined the failure of the penal system and the difficulty in trying to rehabilitate people with some problems in society. The history of Bronson is the tale that makes us look beneath the skin at the several aspects of human behavior. His life stands as testimony to the vicissitudes of human life and an unending war between the desire for freedom and fitment into social mores, equally measured in terms of destruction and creation. With a heavy clang, the iron door shut, and Charles Bronson was once more cast into the all-encompassing silence of solitary confinement. He was familiar with all this situation. The psychological weight of such confinement was great, stripping away layers of his sanity with each passing day. But Bronson was not a man to lie down and be best. He designed for himself a pathological exercise program to deal with the relentless solitude. Every morning he would rise with a determination that belied his circumstances. His cell would become his personal gym, and Bronson would push his body to the limits, each movement a scream of defiance against the monotony and despair that dared to consume him. This fitness regime and the stark isolation of solitary confinement was the sanctuary Bronson had claimed for himself. This became his purpose and a way to live through the vicious attack of being completely and relentlessly alone. This obsessive commitment to physical training provided him a way to retain a shadow of his humanity when everything around him was a process of taking it away from him. This commitment to fitness was not just about survival. It was a profound act of self-preservation and defiance against the forces that sought to diminish him. Inside the gloomy confines of his prison cell, Charles Bronson chiseled a philosophy that would define his existence and subsequently go on to inspire many. What is involved from the center of this philosophy would be synonymous with self-discipline, resilience, and mental courage that could not be bent. These would be the values of Bronsonism. The very single way of Bronson's life would later go on to articulate in the fine details within the book Solitary Fitness. The publication of Solitary Fitness was an intriguing one. People were curious to know more about his personal philosophy of life. The book came to offer more than just tips on fitness, as it was a manifesto of resilience. The words he wrote were touching and resonated among many, becoming a source of inspiration from someone who shows indomitable grit in self-improvement and mental toughness. And so, Bronson's philosophy on self-discipline and tenacity became a guiding star for the wretched in soul to face their own predicament. He demonstrated the power of mind in such a hopeless environment. Through this book, he shared part of his soul, a man who might have been the most notorious criminal, yet his state of being showed an indomitable spirit of survival and self-mastery. Bronson's philosophy was not to be static, or it was inside this cell, this quietude that had continued to shape him in a way that he found he was serving this irresistible capacity for growth and resilience in the human spirit. His legacy on the pages of the book symbolized the mind of a man who made his prison a crucible that forged unyielding mental fortitude and discipline. Inside the cold, gray prison walls, the spirit of Charles Bronson fought on, suffering physical and mental torment, and with great courage battling a legal disposal that, in his very feeling, most gravely maltreated him. It was meant to be a resolute fight to find justice and a way to reform the penal system. Bronson's appeals were all part of his prison life. He argued that his prolonged solitary confinement was a severe violation of his dignity and integrity. His lawyers highlighted the immense mental and psychological stress caused by such extreme isolation, bringing his plight to public attention. This exposure prompted people to reflect on the broader issues within the prison system. His lawyers highlighted the immense mental and psychological stress caused by the isolation bringing to public attention. This exposure prompted people to reflect on the broader issues within the prison system. As public awareness of Bronson's situation grew, so did support for his cause. Many argued that despite his violent past, he had the potential for rehabilitation. His artistic talent and disciplined physical training became focal points for his supporters. Campaigns for his release, or at least for better conditions, gained momentum, with many advocating that he deserved a chance to reform. Facts do not diminish the story of love and human connection that marked his life through 3 marriages. Bronson married Irene Kelsey in 1971. According to Irene, he was different from all others she ever met. He used to wear neatly arranged, tailored suits and sideburns like a pair of fleshy curtains. They had a son together, but the relationship did not last long because of Bronson's burgeoning criminal behavior. Decades later, in 2001, he married again, this time to Bangladeshi divorcee Sarah Ali Ahmed, who had started writing letters to him after seeing his photo in a newspaper. The relationship flourished through letters and visits. Sarah, however, stated that she believed in the goodness of change in Bronson, a belief that extended beyond his artistic endeavors, despite the heavy stigma attached to his name. Yet this lasted barely 4 years. In 2005, they separated, taking Bronson back to facing the isolation one gets used to in prison life. In 2017, Bronson, whose 3rd wife, Paula Williamson, a former actress, visited him in prison, and their relationship also developed by letter and visits. Despite the difficulties of his incarceration, their relationship became strong enough for them to eventually tie the knot in a ceremony in the prison chapel. Paula never lost hope that Bronson could be redeemed, but the failures of maintaining a marriage with a man in his position were harsh on her. Paula also sadly passed away in 2019, one more loss for the man. The marriages evidenced his ability to love and connect even while being in the confines of a prison. Each one of them, although not without an ending of its own, gave reasons behind the complexities of a life that many people view as purely through the crimes committed. Bronson's cycle of love and loss tells the story of humanness in the darkest of places. The Charles Bronson story became synonymous with the word scandal within the British prison system. This was followed by major changes in the management of high-risk prisoners and mental health services. The conduct of prison authorities was lashed into a rethinking of strategies to deal with such extremely violent prisoners, with every act of his progressively violent outbursts and hostage rejection incidents growing into notoriety. His relentless defiance and the psychological toll of his long-term solitary confinement opened up heated debates on the efficiency and humanity of the methods applied. His life in isolation, quite often marked by major mental straining, points to better mental health support within the penitentiary institution. It thus followed that there was a shift towards better psychological care and a more structured mode of rehabilitation for such inmates. But from an overall reform-minded perspective, the story of Bronson was a warning of the difficulties involved in dealing with the headstrong, who, if nothing else, resist the conventional methods of control and rehabilitation. There were, after all, not just stories of Bronson's year. They have catapulted the British prison system into the present, adapted and changed in the face of its most problematic cases. And the stories are those of humane and effective reformation brought to the fore. They remind society of the importance of accounting for the roots of criminal behavior, with insight and compassion. The life of Charles is a tale of rebellion and human duality, which leaves an unforgettable mark upon the British system of punishment, as well as the human conscience of the notions of crime and punishment. From quiet child to Britain's most notorious prisoner, Bronson's life is marked by ceaseless conflict with authority, punctuated by spells of vulnerability and artistic creativity. His life's archetypal tale brings us to the lazy binary boxes of good and bad and makes it imperative for us to see the life and actions of a person through to the underlying reasons. Bronson's years in solitary confinement, his episodes of violence, and his creative output all serve to illuminate the fragility of the human condition. His example points to the necessity of a more compassionate approach to an understanding of criminality, the need for psychological intervention, and the possibility of redemption, even in the direst of circumstances. As we reflect on Bronson's journey, we are reminded that crime punishments are not black and white issues. His story invites us to consider the complexities of human nature and the capacity for change and redemption. For those intrigued by the extraordinary and often unsettling tales of individuality like Charles Bronson, there are many more gripping stories to explore. His legacy is a powerful reminder of the enduring human spirit and the outgoing quest for justice and understanding in a complex world. If you liked watching the video, do like, share, and subscribe.